The pregnancy test sat hidden beneath folded linens in a drawer Rowan would never open. Two pink lines. Proof of life. Proof of her own body's rebellion against a marriage built on contracts and coldness. Alara Vance pressed her palm flat against her stomach, still unchanged, still secret, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years of living at Iron Ridge Manor. Power. Real, dangerous, unspoken power. In 3 hours, her husband would summon her to breakfast with that look he wore, the one that said she was inventory being assessed. He didn't know. Couldn't know. And suddenly, for the first time since their wedding night, Alara held all the cards. If you want to see how far a woman can go when she stops asking for permission and starts taking what's hers, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button. Let's begin. The manor was always coldest before sunrise. Alara had learned this the hard way, during those early weeks after the wedding when she'd still believed warmth might come from somewhere other than the fireplace. She'd waited in bed then, hoping Rowan might turn toward her, might speak something other than logistics and expectations. But he never did. The house taught her its rhythms instead. The groan of old pipes, the scratch of bare branches against leaded windows, the particular quality of silence that existed only in places where people lived together, but not with each other. She sat now in the small reading alcove off the second-floor library, wrapped in a wool shawl that had belonged to her mother. The fabric still held a ghost of lavender sachets, a smell that made her throat tight if she thought about it too long. Through the frost-edged window, the grounds of Iron Ridge stretched gray and formless under pre-dawn snow. Everything looked abandoned. Nothing moved except her own breath, visible in the unheated air. Her hand drifted to her abdomen again. Flat. No visible evidence yet. Just the exhaustion that had pulled at her bones for weeks. The nausea that came in waves during Rowan's interminable dinners with business associates who spoke around her as if she were furniture. She'd thought it was merely the weight of this life, pressing down. But 3 days ago, in the cramped water closet of a shop 2 villages over, somewhere no one from Iron Ridge would ever see her, she'd confirmed what her body had been trying to tell her. A child. Their child, technically, though Rowan had approached the concept of Heir production with all the passion of a man reviewing ledgers. The irony made her want to laugh, or scream, she wasn't sure which. Footsteps echoed from the main hall below. Mrs. Calloway, the head housekeeper, beginning her rounds. Soon the servants would stir the house to life, build fires in the important rooms, prepare breakfast in the cavernous dining room where Alara and Rowan sat at opposite ends of a table built for 16. 2 years of that table. 2 years of chewing in silence while he read correspondence, and she pretended interest in toast she couldn't taste. She pulled the shawl tighter. The thing was, and this was what kept circling back, sharp and insistent, she didn't have to tell him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The thought arrived fully formed, shocking in its clarity. For months, she'd felt like a ghost in her own life, drifting through rooms that would never belong to her, speaking words that nobody heard. But this was hers, this knowledge, this small cluster of cells that would become a person. Rowan had no claim to it yet, because Rowan didn't know it existed, and if she never told him. The possibility unfurled like a map of unmarked territory. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, that distinctive stride, purposeful and contained, the walk of a man who'd inherited everything and earned nothing. Alara straightened, smoothing her expression into the pleasant blankness she'd perfected. When Rowan appeared in the library doorway, still in his dressing gown, she manufactured a small smile. "You're awake early," he said. Not a greeting. An observation, faintly accusatory. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded as if this confirmed something. "I need to speak with you. Breakfast. 8 o'clock sharp." "Of course." He lingered a moment, studying her with those pale gray eyes that never seemed to register her as anything more than a problem requiring solution. Then he turned and left, his footsteps receding toward his private chambers on the east wing, separate from hers as they'd always been. Alara released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. 8 o'clock. Whatever he wanted to discuss, it warranted formality. Rowan didn't do spontaneous conversation. He scheduled his pronouncements the way other men scheduled business meetings. She'd learned to read the signs. Tight jaw meant financial stress. Clipped words meant someone had disappointed him. This particular combination, the early summons, the careful distance, usually preceded some declaration about her inadequacy. She stood, bones aching with cold and something heavier. Dread, maybe. Or just exhaustion at the prospect of another performance. By the time she'd dressed and made her way to the dining room, the house had woken fully. Fires burned in the grates. The smell of bread and coffee drifted from the kitchen. Mr. Hollins, Rowan's valet, stood near the door like a sentinel, face carefully neutral. Alara had always liked Hollins. He was one of the few servants who looked at her as though she were human. But this morning his presence felt ominous. Rowan sat at the head of the table, already dressed for the day in dark wool and stiff collar. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," he said. She took her usual place, 14 feet of polished mahogany between them. For a long moment, he said nothing. Just cut into his breakfast, eggs, sausage, blood pudding, with mechanical precision. Alara's stomach turned. She reached for tea instead, willing her hand steady. "I've made a decision," Rowan said finally, setting down his knife with a soft clink. "One that affects both of us, though primarily you." Here it was, the tone. That particular brand of condescension that made her feel 6 inches tall. "I'm listening," she managed. "This marriage isn't working." He said it the way someone might observe that a piece of equipment had malfunctioned. Factual, unemotional. "You're aware of the expectations when we wed. My family's position requires an heir, that was understood." Alara's pulse began a slow, heavy drumbeat in her ears. She kept her face still. 2 years, Alara. 2 years, and nothing to show for it. He finally looked at her, and the disappointment in his expression was so casual it felt worse than anger. "I've consulted with physicians, with my solicitor. The conclusion is clear." "Clear," she repeated. Her voice came out flat, mechanical. "The fault lies with you." He delivered this like a diagnosis. Whatever the specific cause, constitution, some deficiency, it's become evident that you cannot provide what this marriage requires. Therefore, I'm pursuing an annulment. The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. Annulment. Not divorce. That would imply there'd been a real marriage to end. This was erasure, a legal fiction that would declare their 2 years together had never mattered at all. "You've already decided," she said. Not a question. "The papers are being drawn up. You'll be compensated, of course. A settlement appropriate to your time here. My solicitor suggests—" "Your solicitor." Something sharp and bright ignited in Alara's chest, not quite rage, something colder, more focused. "You've discussed this with your solicitor, with physicians, with who else? Your banker? Your club?" Rowan's eyebrows rose slightly. "I've consulted the appropriate parties, yes. This isn't a decision made lightly. Just without me. You were the subject of the decision. There's a difference." Alara set down her teacup before her shaking hands could betray her. "When?" "The formal proceedings will begin next week. You'll need to vacate Iron Ridge within the month. I'm not unreasonable. You'll have time to make arrangements. My brother died last year." She'd told him this. At the funeral. He'd sent flowers and a note and never mentioned it again. Rowan paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "Ah, yes. Unfortunate. Well, you have other family, surely. Arrangements can be up to—" "Stop." The word came out harder than she'd intended. Rowan actually blinked. "Just stop talking." Silence crashed down. Even Hollins by the door seemed to have stopped breathing. Rowan's expression shifted into something resembling confusion, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken out of turn. "I understand this is difficult." "Do you?" Alara stood. The chair scraped against polished floor, a sound too loud in the massive room. "Do you understand anything about this? About me?" "You're being emotional." "I'm being human." She heard her voice rising and didn't care. 2 years of careful composure, of swallowing words, of making herself small and pleasant and invisible. It all came roaring up like a flood. "For 2 years, I've lived in this mausoleum pretending to be whatever you needed me to be. A decorative wife for dinner parties. A potential broodmare for your precious bloodline. Never a person. Never someone worth actually knowing." Rowan set down his silverware with exaggerated patience. "If you're quite finished—" "I'm not." Alara's hands clenched at her sides. Every instinct screamed at her to sit down, apologize, smooth things over. She ignored them all. You want to know why there's no heir? Perhaps because you've barely touched me since the wedding night. Perhaps because you treat intimacy like a quarterly obligation. Perhaps because a woman needs more than a cursory effort every few months and a husband who looks at her like defective livestock. Color rose in Rowan's face, actual emotion, finally. That's inappropriate. It's true. The words kept coming, unstoppable now. You never wanted a wife. You wanted a function, someone to fill a role in your orderly little world. And when I didn't perform to specification, you decided to exchange me for a better model. This is exactly why I didn't discuss it with you beforehand. Rowan stood too, jaw tight. You're clearly incapable of rational conversation about. Get out, he stopped. Excuse me? Get out. Alara pointed toward the door, hand trembling but voice steady. This is my breakfast too. My house too, at least for another month. And I'm done listening to you explain why I failed at being human furniture. For a long moment, Rowan just stared at her. She could see him calculating, trying to reassert control through sheer force of aristocratic certainty. But something in her expression, maybe the absolute lack of fear or the dawning realization that she had nothing left to lose, made him hesitate. We'll continue this discussion when you've calmed down, he said finally, gathering his dignity like armor. No, we won't. He left. Hollins trailed after him, shooting Alara one quick, unreadable glance before closing the door. The moment she was alone, Alara's legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the edge of the table, breathing hard, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and shock, and something that might have been exhilaration. She'd just burned it all down. The smart thing, the strategic thing, would have been to tell him. Right then. I'm pregnant, you fool. Your heir is already growing. You have no grounds for annulment. She could have watched his face change, watched him recalculate, watched him realize his mistake. Could have used that knowledge like a weapon to keep her place here, to force him into acknowledging her value. But the thought of it made her physically ill. Because what then? 9 months of Rowan hovering, not out of care but possession. 9 months of being even more of a vessel, a container for the thing he actually wanted. And after, a lifetime of being mother to his child, wife to his title, forever bound to this cold house and this colder man. The alternative crystallized in her mind with sudden, terrifying clarity. She could leave, not in a month, after papers and proceedings and lawyers picking over the corpse of their marriage. Not with a settlement and arrangements and everyone knowing she'd been discarded. She could leave now. Tonight. Take what was hers, her clothes, her mother's jewelry, the small inheritance she'd never touched, and disappear before Rowan's annulment could erase her. And the child? Her hand went to her stomach again. Hers. Only hers. No one else would ever have to know. The enormity of it hit her all at once. The impossibility, the danger, the sheer audacity. Single women didn't just vanish into the countryside and raise children alone. There were no provisions for that kind of life, no safety net, no social structure to catch her if she fell. But there was Aunt Margaret. The name surfaced like a lifeline. Margaret Thorn, her mother's sister, who'd scandalized the family 30 years ago by refusing marriage, buying a small estate in the northern countryside, and living exactly as she pleased. Alara hadn't seen her since childhood, but she remembered a woman with sharp eyes and sharper wit who told her once, "Never let anyone convince you that their idea of your life matters more than your own. If anyone would understand, it was Margaret. If anyone would help, it was Margaret. If she could get there." Alara straightened, decision settling into her bones like steel. She had maybe 12 hours before Rowan's shock wore off, and he started watching her more carefully. 12 hours to pack what mattered, to withdraw her inheritance from the account her father had set up years ago, to arrange transportation without arousing suspicion. 12 hours to vanish. She moved through the rest of the morning in a strange, heightened state, hyper-focused and distant all at once. She took lunch in her room, claiming a headache. Mrs. Calloway brought tea and sympathy. Alara accepted both with a wan smile. By mid-afternoon, she'd packed a single trunk with practical clothing, her mother's pearl necklace, the few books that meant something. Everything else, the elaborate gowns Rowan had commissioned, the jewelry he'd given her on holidays, all the beautiful, useless things that decorated the shell of Lady Vance, she left. The money was harder. Her inheritance sat in an account requiring 2 signatures for withdrawal, hers and her husband's, a provision her father had insisted on for her protection. She'd never questioned it before. Now it felt like chains, but her mother's jewelry was hers outright, inherited before the marriage. The pearls alone would fetch enough to survive on for months if she was careful. And the small cash she'd been setting aside from household accounts, pin money that Rowan never tracked, that would get her north. By evening, everything was ready. Her trunk sat in her dressing room, innocuous and waiting. She'd sent a carefully worded telegram to Margaret that afternoon. "May I visit? Urgently need change of scenery. Will explain in person." No response yet, but she couldn't wait for one. Rowan didn't appear for dinner. His absence felt like confirmation. He was done with her, already moving on to whatever came next. Good. Let him think her subdued and manageable. At 9 o'clock, Elara told Mrs. Calloway she was retiring early. "Please don't disturb me. I need rest." "Of course, milady." The housekeeper's face held concern. "Can I bring you anything? Warm milk?" "No, thank you. Just quiet." She waited until the house settled into its nighttime rhythms. 11 o'clock. Midnight. The snow had started again, thick and muffling. Perfect. At 1 in the morning, Elara put on her warmest coat, hat, and gloves. She picked up her trunk, lighter than she'd expected, everything she actually valued fitting into a space smaller than she'd imagined, and crept down the servants' stairs. The back entrance stood unguarded. No one expected the lady of the house to be fleeing through the kitchen. The cold hit her like a wall. The snow fell in heavy, silent curtains, already covering the ground in fresh white. Her boots crunched too loud in the stillness. Every sound felt like an alarm, but no lights flickered on, no voices called out. She'd arranged for a coach to wait a mile down the road, paid extra for discretion and an early departure. The walk felt endless. Her trunk growing heavier, the cold seeping through her layers, doubt creeping in with every difficult step. But then she saw it. The dark shape of the coach, the horses stamping and blowing steam, the driver hunched on his seat. "Mrs. Smith?" he asked, the false name she'd given. "Yes." He took her trunk, helped her inside. The door closed. The coach lurched into motion. Elara looked back once, through the small rear window. Iron Ridge Manor sat dark and imposing against the snowy sky. Every window blank, the whole massive structure looking less like a home than a monument to things already dead. Then the coach turned and it disappeared from view. She pressed her hand to her stomach, to the secret growing there, the life that was hers alone, and felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not happiness, not yet, but possibility. For the first time in 2 years, the future wasn't a trap. It was a door she'd kicked open herself, and she was walking through it into complete, terrifying, glorious uncertainty. The coach rattled north through the snow, carrying her toward whatever came next. Behind her, in the house she'd abandoned, Rowan would wake to find her gone. Would rage, probably. Would send people looking, maybe. But by then she'd be miles away, becoming someone new. Not Lady Vance, failed wife of Iron Ridge Manor. Just Elara. Mother. Survivor. Free. The journey north took 3 days that felt like 3 weeks. The coach broke down twice. Once outside a village whose name Elara never learned, and again in a stretch of frozen moorland where the wind cut through her coat like knives. The driver, a taciturn man named Brennan, who asked no questions and offered no conversation, managed repairs both times with the grim competence of someone accustomed to things going wrong. Elara sat in the cold interior, wrapped in every layer she had, and tried not to think about what she'd done. Tried not to imagine Rowan's face when he discovered her empty room. Tried not to calculate how long her money would actually last. Tried not to wonder if Margaret would even remember her, let alone take her in. The nausea didn't help. It came in waves now, unpredictable and vicious. She'd packed dry biscuits and ginger tea, but they only did so much. By the second day, Brennan had noticed her retching discreetly into a handkerchief and wordlessly handed her a flask of something that smelled like mint and tasted like fire. It helped. She didn't ask what was in it. They stopped at coaching inns each night, small, smoky establishments where Elara kept her head down and her story simple. Traveling to family. Husband delayed on business. The lies came easier than she'd expected. No one looked too closely at a well-dressed woman with a wedding ring and a plausible explanation. But on the third night, at an inn called the Shepherd's Rest, her luck fractured. She was eating a silent dinner of mutton stew when two men entered, shaking snow from their coats. Something about them registered wrong immediately. Too watchful, too deliberate. They scanned the room with the methodical attention of people looking for something specific. Alara kept her eyes on her bowl, pulse suddenly hammering. "Excuse me, miss." One of them appeared at her table, tall, with a face like weathered stone. "We're looking for someone. A woman traveling alone. Dark hair, well-spoken. May have left the southern counties recently." Her hand stayed steady on her spoon through sheer force of will. "I'm afraid I can't help you. You fit the description." "So do many women, I imagine." She met his gaze, channeling every ounce of aristocratic disdain she'd learned watching Rowan dismiss servants. "And I'm not traveling alone. My husband is upstairs, unwell. I'd appreciate not being disturbed." The man's eyes narrowed, but before he could press further, the innkeeper bustled over. "Is there a problem here?" "Just asking questions," the second man said. He was shorter, with quick, nervous energy. "Lord Hale's wife has gone missing. He's offering a substantial reward for information." The innkeeper looked at Alara with new interest. She forced herself to laugh, light, dismissive. "How exciting. Unfortunately, as I told your friend, my husband is resting upstairs. Perhaps you should check with guests who are actually alone?" She stood, gathering her skirts with the imperious air of someone accustomed to not being questioned. "Good evening, gentlemen." The walk to the stairs felt like miles. Every step she expected a hand on her shoulder, a voice calling her back. But she made it to the room Brennan had secured, small, cold, with a door that actually locked, and collapsed against it the moment it closed. They were looking for her. Rowan had sent people. Of course he had. Not out of concern, she knew that much. But she was his property until the annulment finalized, and property didn't get to just walk away. There would be questions, embarrassment, his control challenged. Rowan wouldn't tolerate that. She had to move faster. Brennan, when she found him in the stables an hour later, listened to her revised plan with his usual impassive expression. "We leave before dawn," Alara said. "I'll pay extra. Those men are watching the roads. Then we take a different route." "There aren't different routes in winter, ma'am, not safe ones." "I don't care about safe." Her voice came out harder than intended. "I care about not being dragged back to a life that will kill me slowly. Can you do it or not?" Brennan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. 4 o'clock. "Be ready." They left in darkness so complete that Alara couldn't see her own hands. The coach lurched and swayed over roads that were barely roads, more like suggestions of paths through endless white. Twice they nearly overturned. Once, they got stuck in a drift so deep that Alara had to climb out and help push, her fine boots sinking into snow up to her knees, her muscles screaming. But they avoided the main routes, avoided the watchers. By the time weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, they'd put 20 miles between themselves and the Shepherd's Rest. Margaret's estate appeared through the snow like something from a fever dream, a sprawling stone house with ivy-covered walls and chimneys puffing steady smoke. Smaller than Iron Ridge, less imposing, but infinitely more welcoming. Lights glowed in multiple windows. The grounds, though snow-covered, showed signs of actual care. Alara's chest tightened with something dangerously close to hope. Brennan pulled up to the entrance. Before Alara could gather herself, the door opened and a figure emerged, tall, thin, wrapped in an enormous fur coat that made her look like an elegant bear. "Well," the woman called out, voice carrying sharp and clear across the snow. "Are you going to sit in that coach all day, or are you coming inside before we both freeze?" Margaret, older than Alara remembered, her hair completely silver now, her face lined, but unmistakably the same woman who'd scandalized dinner parties with opinions about women's suffrage and property rights. Alara climbed down on shaking legs. "Aunt Margaret, Inside first. Explanations later. Brennan, bring her trunk to the blue room." Margaret grabbed Alara's arm with surprising strength and steered her toward the door. "You look half dead. When did you last eat something that wasn't saddle leather?" Yesterday? Maybe. Unacceptable. Come on." The interior of Thorn House was chaos compared to Iron Ridge's sterile order. Books everywhere, papers stacked on surfaces, a massive ginger cat occupying the best chair by the fire. But it was warm, actually warm, in a way that went beyond temperature. Margaret deposited Ilara in said chair. The cat relocated with an irritated meow and disappeared. She returned moments later with a tray containing soup, bread, cheese, and tea so hot it steamed. "Eat," Margaret commanded, "then talk." Ilara managed 3 spoonfuls before her composure cracked entirely. The tears came sudden and overwhelming, 2 years' worth of them. And once they started, she couldn't stop. Margaret didn't try to comfort her with words or touches. She just sat in the opposite chair, waiting, occasionally refilling the tea. When Ilara finally ran dry, throat raw and eyes burning, Margaret spoke. "Better?" "No. Yes. I don't know." Ilara wiped her face with the back of her hand, an undignified gesture that would have horrified Rowan. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have imposed—" "Stop." Margaret's voice cut clean. "I got your telegram. I've been expecting you for 2 days. What took so long?" "The coach broke down, and then there were men looking for me, and we had to take back roads." The words tumbled out. "Rowan wants an annulment. He thinks I'm barren. He's already drawn up papers. I left before I had to—" She stopped, hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. Margaret's sharp eyes tracked the movement. "But you're not barren." It wasn't a question. Ilara's breath caught. "How did you— You're eating for 2 and still look ready to faint. You can't keep your hand off your belly, and you ran instead of fighting." Margaret leaned back, expression unreadable. "How far along?" 8 weeks, maybe 9. "Does he know?" "No." "Anyone?" "Just you, now." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentler than Ilara had ever heard it. "What do you want, child? Not what you think you should want. Not what anyone else expects. What do you want?" The question hit like a physical blow. No one had asked her that in so long she'd almost forgotten it was possible to want things for herself. "I want," Ilara's voice cracked. "I want to keep this baby. I want to raise them somewhere they won't learn that love is a transaction. I want to never go back to that house. I want—" She laughed, bitter and sharp. "I want impossible things. Nothing you listed is impossible. I have no money, no prospects, no husband. Society will—" "Society," Margaret interrupted, "can go hang. This is my house, my land. No one here cares about scandal because we're too far from anywhere that matters. You can stay as long as you need." Hope flared so bright it hurt. "Margaret, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering. There's a difference." Margaret stood, brushing cat hair off her skirt. "But I won't lie to you. It won't be easy. Rowan will look for you. Men like him don't tolerate losing things they consider theirs. You'll need to stay invisible for a while. Maybe a long while." "I know. And when the baby comes, people will talk. They'll make assumptions. Some of them true, some not. Can you handle that?" Ilara thought about Iron Ridge's cold halls, about 2 years of being invisible in plain sight, about the slow suffocation of a life spent meeting everyone's expectations except her own. "Yes," she said. "I can handle it." "Good." Margaret's smile was sharp and approving. "Then welcome to Thorn House. Fair warning, we don't stand on ceremony here. You'll be expected to help with work, not sit around like decorative china. I run a small bookbinding business, restoration mostly. Can you use your hands?" I used to embroider. Before." "Close enough. We'll teach you the rest." Margaret headed toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. What should I call you? Because Lady Vance isn't going to work if we're trying to keep you hidden." Ilara hadn't thought about it. The name felt like a costume she'd been wearing, ill-fitting and borrowed. "My mother's name was Clara." "Clara it is." Margaret nodded. "Get some rest, Clara. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to build you a life worth living." She left. The cat reclaimed its chair, curling against Ilara's leg with a rumbling purr. Ilara sat in the firelight, one hand on her stomach, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that this might actually work. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment and exhaustion. Margaret's household ran on routines utterly foreign to anything Ilara had known. Breakfast at 7, everyone together in the kitchen, Margaret, her housekeeper Mrs. Dawes, the groundskeeper Mr. Farrow, a rotation of local women who helped with binding work. No servants' quarters, no separation of classes. Just people eating porridge and arguing cheerfully about everything from politics to the best method for pressing leather. Clara now, she had to remember, mostly stayed quiet and tried not to break anything. Margaret put her to work immediately. Idle hands make anxious minds, she declared, installing Clara at a work table in the converted library that served as the binding workshop. The first task was simple: cleaning old glue off damaged book spines. Tedious, precise work that required focus, but not expertise. Clara found it surprisingly soothing. The books themselves were fascinating. Volumes rescued from estate sales and water-damaged libraries, some dating back centuries. Margaret specialized in resurrection, taking things others deemed beyond saving and making them whole again. There was something almost holy about it, though Clara kept that thought to herself. "This one's interesting," Margaret said on the third day, setting a battered manuscript on Clara's table. "Medieval prayer book. Water damage, spine completely gone, half the pages stuck together. Client offered triple my usual rate to restore it." Clara examined it carefully. The vellum pages were stained and warped, the illuminated capitals barely visible through centuries of neglect. Can it be saved? Everything can be saved. Question is whether it's worth the effort. Margaret's eyes glinted. "What do you think?" It felt like a test. Clara ran her fingers over the damaged binding, thinking. The materials are expensive. The time investment is massive, but if the client values it enough to pay triple rate, then yes, worth it. Wrong answer. Clara looked up, startled. "The question isn't what the client values," Margaret said. "It's what you value. Does this book deserve to exist? Does it have something to offer? Because if you're only working for payment, you'll never do anything great. You'll just do things adequately for money." "That's a luxury," Clara said quietly. "Choosing what matters. It's a necessity. People who don't choose what matters end up in lives they hate." Margaret's gaze was uncomfortably direct. "Like you did." Clara's jaw tightened. "I didn't have choices." "You always have choices. They're just not always good ones." Margaret pulled up a stool. "You chose to leave. That took more courage than most people manage in a lifetime. Don't diminish it by pretending you were helpless." The words stung because they were partially true. Clara had chosen to leave, but she'd also been backed into a corner with no good options. Was that agency or desperation? Before she could formulate a response, Mrs. Dawes appeared in the doorway, face tight with concern. "Miss Margaret, there's someone at the door. Says he's looking for a woman matching Clara's description. Has papers from some lord down south." The workshop went silent. Clara's heart stopped. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something hardened in her eyes. "Papers?" "Legal something. Kept saying Lord Hale's property." Clara stood so fast her stool toppled. "I'll go. I'll leave before—" "Sit down." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "This is my house. No one tells me who I can shelter." She turned to Mrs. Dawes. "Send him to the sitting room. Offer tea. I'll be there shortly." "Margaret, you can't—" Clara started. "I can do whatever I damn well please on my own land. That's the point of owning it." Margaret was already moving, shedding her work apron and straightening her collar. "You stay here, out of sight. Farrow, you're with me." The groundskeeper, a massive man with hands like shovels, appeared from somewhere and followed Margaret out. Clara stood frozen, listening to footsteps recede. Mrs. Dawes gave her a sympathetic look. "Don't worry, dear. Miss Margaret's handled worse than lawyers." But Clara's mind was racing. If Rowan had sent someone here, he knew where she was, or suspected. How? Had someone at the Shepherd's Rest talked? Had Brennan been questioned? The minutes crawled past. Clara couldn't sit, couldn't work, could barely breathe. She paced the workshop like a caged animal, every worst scenario playing out in her head. Being dragged back to Iron Ridge. Forced into the annulment publicly. Losing the baby to stress or worse. Or worse, Rowan discovering the pregnancy and using it to keep her trapped forever. Footsteps on the stairs. Clara spun toward the door. Margaret entered alone, face stormy. She was holding papers, official-looking documents with seals and signatures. "He's gone," Margaret said. "For now." "What did he want?" To serve you with preliminary annulment papers. Apparently you need to sign acknowledgement of receipt, or the proceedings can't move forward. Margaret tossed the papers onto the work table with disgust. I told him no one by the name of Alara Vance resides here. He implied I was lying. I implied he could take his implications and his papers and find a cliff to walk off. Despite everything, Clara felt a hysterical laugh bubble up. You didn't. I did. Pharaoh may have helped convince him that leaving was his best option. Margaret's smile was sharp and satisfied. But Clara, this is serious. They know you're in the area. They'll keep looking. I know. Clara sank onto the stool, all the fight draining out. Maybe I should just sign the papers. Let him have his annulment. At least then he'd stop searching. And when the baby comes? When there's a child who is legally his heir, whether he wants to acknowledge it or not? Margaret shook her head. You can't just give him what he wants and hope he goes away. Men like Rowan don't work that way. Then what do I do? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. There's an option. Risky, possibly illegal, definitely unconventional. Tell me. We could file papers claiming he abandoned you. Flip the narrative entirely. If we move fast, get documentation of you being in residence here, establish that he threw you out without support, we might be able to force him into a defensive position. Clara stared. That's insane. Yes. It would make him furious. Undoubtedly. He has more money, more lawyers, more arrogance, Margaret finished, which makes people sloppy, and we have something he doesn't. What? The truth. Or at least a version of it compelling enough that people will believe it. Margaret leaned forward. Think about it. Young woman married off to cold aristocrat. 2 years of isolation, finally escapes to her only living relative. Husband claims she's deficient when really he's the one who failed to... She paused delicately. Well, provide adequate attention. You want me to publicly humiliate him. I want you to survive. If that humiliates him, all the better. Margaret's expression softened slightly. But it's your choice. You can sign his papers, let the annulment proceed quietly, and hope he never finds out about the baby. Or you can fight back. Clara looked at the legal documents on the table, Rowan's handwriting on the signature line, the cold, clinical language reducing their marriage to a failed business arrangement. 2 years she'd spent making herself smaller, quieter, less. 2 years of swallowing words and accepting blame and pretending his version of reality was the only one that mattered. And where had that gotten her? Alone, pregnant, hiding in a workshop while his lawyers hunted her down. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. How quickly can we file? Clara asked. Margaret's smile could have cut glass. I know a solicitor in town who owes me a favor. We could have papers drawn up by tomorrow. Do it. Clara, no. She stood, something hard and bright crystallizing in her chest. I'm done running. I'm done accepting whatever judgment he hands down. If he wants a legal battle, fine. I'll give him one he actually has to fight. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded with clear satisfaction. Good. Now we're getting somewhere. They worked late into the night, drafting statements and gathering what evidence they could. Letters Clara had written to her brother, describing the loneliness of Iron Ridge. Household accounts showing the separate bedrooms. Small, humiliating details that painted a picture of a marriage that had never really existed. It felt like stripping herself bare. But it also felt like taking control. By dawn, they had enough for Margaret's solicitor to start building a case. Clara signed her name at the bottom of the petition, not Alara Vance, but E.C. Vance, a small rebellion that made her hand shake, and felt something shift inside her. She'd made her choice. Now she had to live with it. Margaret sent the papers off with a messenger that morning. It'll take a few days to file properly. After that, all hell will probably break loose. I know. Rowan will retaliate. He'll dig for anything he can use against you. Let him. Clara met Margaret's eyes steadily. There's nothing he can find that's worse than what I already lived through. But 3 days later, she discovered how wrong she was. The letter arrived mid-morning, delivered by the same man who'd brought the annulment papers. Margaret opened it at the breakfast table, scanned it quickly, and went pale. What? Clara demanded. What is it? Margaret handed over the letter without a word. The language was legal and cold, but the threat was clear. Rowan was petitioning to have Clara declared mentally unfit, claiming she'd shown signs of hysteria, delusion, and instability, citing her sudden departure, her false accusations, her refusal to cooperate with reasonable annulment proceedings. If successful, she'd be committed. All her assets would go into trusteeship under his control. Any future children would be declared his wards regardless of paternity. Clara's vision tunneled. The paper crumpled in her shaking hands. "He can't," she whispered. "He can't do that." "He can try." Margaret's voice was grim. "And with enough money and the right physicians, he might succeed." The room spun. Clara gripped the edge of the table, fighting waves of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. If Rowan got her committed, she'd lose everything: her freedom, her child, her very self. She'd be locked away in some institution while he rewrote history however he pleased. "I'll withdraw the petition," Clara said. Her voice sounded distant, mechanical. "I'll sign his annulment. Whatever he wants. Just make this stop." "No." "Margaret, you don't understand?" "I understand perfectly." Margaret's hand closed over Clara's, firm and steady. "He's trying to scare you into submission. That's all this is. Empty threats to make you fold." "They're not empty. He has doctors, lawyers, influence, and we have the truth. We have witnesses who will testify you're perfectly sane. We have documentation of his neglect." Margaret's grip tightened. "But only if you don't give up now. The moment you sign his papers, you lose any leverage. You become whatever story he wants to tell." Clara pulled her hand away, standing so abruptly the chair scraped. "You're asking me to risk my child's future on a legal gamble. I'm asking you to fight for it. It's not your risk to take." "No," Margaret agreed quietly. "It's yours, and I can't make that choice for you." Silence filled the kitchen. Outside, snow fell in soft, relentless patterns. Inside, Clara felt the weight of impossible decisions pressing down. She could surrender, sign the papers, disappear completely, raise her child in secret, and hope Rowan never looked closely enough to find them. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, but it meant living in fear forever, always looking over her shoulder, always wondering when he'd discover the truth. Or she could fight, knowing she might lose, knowing the cost of losing was catastrophic. Her hand went to her stomach, instinctive now, comforting. "What do you want?" Margaret had asked. What she wanted was simple, impossible, essential. She wanted her child to grow up watching their mother stand her ground, not hide, not compromise herself into nothing, stand, even if it meant falling. "All right," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'll fight. But Margaret, if this goes wrong, if they come for me..." She met her aunt's eyes. "Promise me you'll take the baby, no matter what. Promise." Margaret's expression cracked, just slightly. "I promise." Clara nodded. Then, before she could second guess, before fear could swallow her whole, she picked up the crumpled legal threat and walked to the fireplace. She dropped it into the flames and watched it burn. The paper curled and blackened in the flames, edges glowing orange before disintegrating into ash. Clara watched until nothing remained but carbon and heat, then turned to find Margaret watching her with something that looked almost like pride. "Well," her aunt said, "I suppose that's decided then." The next 48 hours moved with the relentless momentum of an avalanche. Margaret's solicitor, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Pembroke, who wore men's trousers and didn't apologize for it, arrived that afternoon with a leather case full of documents and a strategy that made Clara's head spin. "We need to establish you as a credible witness to your own life," Mrs. Pembroke said, spreading papers across Margaret's dining table. "Right now, Hale is controlling the narrative. Wife leaves inexplicably, refuses reasonable settlement, makes wild accusations. From his perspective, it reads like instability." "It wasn't inexplicable," Clara said tightly. "He threw me out. He offered you an annulment with financial compensation. Legally, that's generous." Mrs. Pembroke held up a hand before Clara could object. "I'm not saying I agree. I'm saying how a court will see it. We need to shift that perception." "How? Testimony, documentation, witnesses who can attest to the conditions at Iron Ridge Manor." Mrs. Pembroke pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "Tell me everything. And I mean everything. Every slight, every cruelty, every moment that made you feel less than human. If it happened, I need to know." So Clara talked. For hours, she dredged up memories she'd tried to bury. The silent breakfast, the separate bedrooms, the way Rowan would introduce her at dinner parties, and then proceed to ignore her existence for the rest of the evening. The time she'd tried to discuss household improvements, and he'd told her to focus on her primary function. The physician he'd brought in who'd examined her like livestock and declared her adequate in constitution if disappointing in production. Mrs. Pembroke wrote it all down with clinical efficiency, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made Clara's stomach turn. Did he ever strike you? No, he barely touched me at all. Verbal abuse? Threats? Nothing overt, just absence, like I was furniture he'd grown tired of looking at. Mrs. Pembroke's pen paused. That's actually more useful than you'd think. Physical abuse, people expect. But systematic emotional neglect in a marriage of convenience? That plays well. Makes him look callous rather than passionate. I don't want to destroy him, Clara said quietly. I just want him to leave me alone. Then you're in the wrong fight. Mrs. Pembroke's gaze was direct, unflinching. Men like Hale don't leave people alone. They win or they escalate. If you want this to end, you need to make winning more costly than walking away. Margaret, who'd been listening from her chair by the fire, made a noise of agreement. She's right. Rowan's pride won't let him back down unless backing down looks like the smart move. So we humiliate him publicly? Clara felt sick. Drag his name through court proceedings and hope he decides it's not worth it? We make him look incompetent, Mrs. Pembroke corrected. There's a difference. Humiliation breeds vengeance. But incompetence? That breeds doubt. If we can establish that he failed as a husband, not through malice but through sheer inability to fulfill basic marital duties, then his claim that you're the deficient party falls apart. Clara thought about Rowan's cold efficiency, his meticulous control over every aspect of Iron Ridge. He'll fight that narrative. Of course he will, which is why we need witnesses who'll contradict him. Mrs. Pembroke consulted her notes. Do you have anyone from the household who might testify? Servants who saw the separate bedrooms, the lack of interaction? They're his servants, his employees. Why would they? Because servants see everything and often resent being treated poorly themselves. Mrs. Pembroke leaned forward. Think, Clara. Was there anyone at Iron Ridge who showed you kindness? Anyone who seemed uncomfortable with how he treated you? Mr. Hollins. The valet who'd looked at her like she was human. Mrs. Calloway, who'd brought tea and sympathy. Even some of the younger maids who'd sometimes met her eyes with what looked like pity. But asking them to betray their employer? I can't, Clara said. Even if they wanted to help, he'd destroy them, fire them without references, blacklist them across the county. They have families, livelihoods. So do you. Mrs. Pembroke's voice was gentle but implacable. And right now, his next move is to have you declared insane. If that succeeds, you lose everything, including the ability to protect those servants from anything. But if you win, if you establish yourself as a credible party with legitimate grievances, then suddenly testimony against him becomes legally protected whistleblowing, not betrayal. The logic was sound. Clara hated it anyway. I'll think about it, she said. Think fast. We have maybe a week before his petition for mental incompetence goes before a magistrate. After Mrs. Pembroke left, Clara retreated to the small bedroom that had become hers. The space was simple. A bed, a desk, a window overlooking snow-covered gardens. But it felt more like home than Iron Ridge ever had. She sat at the desk and pulled out writing paper, staring at the blank page. Dear Mr. Hollins. She couldn't do it. Couldn't ask someone else to risk everything for her fight. But she also couldn't let Rowan win by default. Her hand moved to her stomach, where the pregnancy was just beginning to show. A small curve visible only when she stood in profile. In another month, it would be obvious. In 2, undeniable. The timeline was compressing around her like a vice. A knock at the door interrupted her spiral. Margaret entered without waiting for permission, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of something amber. Medicinal, she said, pouring. And before you object, 1 drink won't hurt the baby, and it might keep you from vibrating out of your own skin. Clara accepted the glass, took a tiny sip. It burned pleasantly, loosening something tight in her chest. I don't know what to do. Yes, you do. You're just afraid of doing it. Margaret settled into the room's only chair. Write the letters, ask for help, see who answers. And if no one does, then we find another way. But Clara, you can't protect everyone. Sometimes you have to trust that people can make their own choices about what risks they're willing to take. Rowan will crush anyone who testifies against him. Probably. Margaret took a drink. But people aren't as fragile as you think, and some of them might surprise you. Clara looked at the blank page again. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she began writing. She kept the letters simple. No emotional manipulation, no begging, just facts. She was fighting an annulment, needed testimony about conditions at Iron Ridge, understood the risks, and wouldn't judge anyone who declined. She wrote to Hollins, to Mrs. Calloway, to the head gardener who'd sometimes snuck her flowers from the greenhouse. 7 letters total, sent through channels Margaret's network could keep discreet. Then she waited. 3 days of silence. Clara threw herself into bookbinding work, learning to repair spines and restore pages with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The precision required, the careful measurement, the exact pressure, gave her something to focus on besides the gnawing anxiety. On the 4th day, a response arrived. Mrs. Calloway had written back. The letter was brief, the handwriting shaky with either age or fear. Miss Alara, I cannot testify in court as Lord Hale would certainly dismiss me, and I have a sister dependent on my wages, but I have kept a daily household log for 20 years, as is my duty. If such records were to be accidentally misplaced during my afternoon walk and subsequently found by a passerby near the stone bridge at the edge of the Iron Ridge grounds, I could hardly be held responsible. Fridays at 2 o'clock is when I typically take that walk. My condolences on your difficult situation. Monsieur Calloway. Clara read it 3 times, throat tight. It wasn't testimony, but it was something. Proof that she wasn't entirely alone. It's a risk for her, Margaret observed, reading over Clara's shoulder. Those logs could be traced back. I know. Clara folded the letter carefully. Which is why I'm going myself. If anyone's going to be implicated in theft, it should be me. Don't be ridiculous. You're 8 weeks pregnant and Rowan has people watching for you. I'll send Pharaoh. No. Clara stood, decision crystallizing. This is my fight. I won't ask other people to take risks I'm not willing to take myself. Besides, I know the grounds. I can get in and out without being seen. Clara, I'm going, Margaret. You can help me plan it, or you can watch me do it badly, but either way, I'm going. Her aunt stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. You're as stubborn as your mother was. Fine, but we do it smart. Maps, timing, contingency plans. And you take Pharaoh as backup, non-negotiable. They spent the next day planning with the meticulous care of a military operation. Margaret produced detailed maps of Iron Ridge's grounds. Apparently she'd visited years ago, before the family falling out that had left her and Rowan's father on permanent non-speaking terms. The stone bridge was marked clearly, about a quarter mile from the main house, accessible through the wooded section that bordered the eastern edge of the estate. 2 o'clock Friday is risky, Pharaoh said, his rumbling voice unusually serious. Still daylight. Better to wait until dark. Mrs. Calloway specified Friday at 2, Clara countered. That's when she'll be there. We change the timing. We risk missing her entirely. So we get there early, scout the area, make sure it's clear. Pharaoh traced a path on the map with one thick finger. Go in through the old access road here. It's overgrown, but passable. Park a mile out, approach on foot. You grab the logs, we're out in 15 minutes. What if someone sees us? Then I'll make sure they don't see clearly. Pharaoh's expression was grimly amused. I'm not without skills, Miss Clara. Friday arrived gray and bitter, the kind of cold that seeped through layers and settled in bones. Clara dressed in her plainest clothes, dark wool, sturdy boots, a hat that shadowed her face. Margaret pressed a small knife into her hand at the door. Just in case, her aunt said. And Clara, if anything goes wrong, if you see anyone who shouldn't be there, if you feel unsafe for even a second, you run. The logs aren't worth your life. I know. Do you? Margaret's grip on her arm was tight. Because I've watched you develop a somewhat alarming tendency toward self-sacrifice lately. Whatever's in those logs, it's not worth getting caught. Clara kissed her aunt's cheek impulsively. I'll be careful, I promise. The journey to Iron Ridge took 3 hours. Pharaoh drove in tense silence, occasionally checking behind them for followers. They saw no one. The winter landscape rolled past, increasingly familiar as they approached territory Clara had once considered home. When the estate's stone walls came into view, her chest tightened with sense memories. Arriving here as a bride 2 years ago, hopeful and terrified. Walking these grounds alone during the first months, trying to convince herself she could grow to love this place. Leaving in the dark with everything she valued packed into a single trunk. Pharaoh parked where he'd indicated in a copse of trees that hid the cart from the road. They proceeded on foot, moving quickly through winter-bare woods. The snow had mostly melted here, leaving the ground muddy and treacherous. Clara's boots squelched with each step, loud in the quiet afternoon. The stone bridge appeared through the trees, an old decorative structure spanning a half-frozen stream. Clara checked her pocket watch. 1:45. They were early. "Wait here," Pharaoh murmured, gesturing to a cluster of rocks that offered cover. "I'll check the perimeter." He disappeared into the trees with surprising stealth for a man his size. Clara crouched behind the rocks, heart hammering. From here she could see the bridge clearly, and beyond it, glimpses of Iron Ridge's chimneys rising against gray sky. She'd lived there, slept there, slowly died there. The thought made her nauseated, though that might have been the pregnancy. Movement caught her eye. Mrs. Calloway appeared on the far side of the bridge, bundled in a heavy coat, moving with the careful steps of someone who knew she was being watched. She carried a market basket, playing the part of a housekeeper on an afternoon errand. Clara started to rise, but Pharaoh's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Wait," he breathed. "Something's off." "What are you—" Then she saw them. 2 men, positioned in the trees on opposite sides of the bridge. Not gardeners, not estate workers. They had the same watchful quality as the men from the Shepherd's Rest. Rowan's people. "It's a trap," Pharaoh said flatly. Clara's blood went cold. Mrs. Calloway, she might not have had a choice, might not even know. Pharaoh was already pulling her back, away from the bridge. "We need to leave, now." "But the logs, our bait, come on." They retreated through the woods as quickly as stealth allowed, Pharaoh setting a punishing pace. Clara's breath came hard. Her pregnancy-affected stamina struggling to keep up. Behind them, she heard shouting. The men had spotted something, or maybe Mrs. Calloway had signaled them somehow. They burst out of the tree line near where they'd left the cart. Pharaoh lifted Clara bodily into the seat, no time for dignity, and had them moving before she'd fully caught her breath. "Did they see us?" Clara gasped. "Don't know. Doesn't matter. We're leaving either way." But as they rounded the first bend, another cart blocked the road. Clara's stomach dropped. Mr. Hollins sat in the driver's seat, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Next to him, rigid and furious, was Rowan. Pharaoh pulled the horses up short. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Rowan climbed down from his cart with deliberate precision, brushing invisible dust from his coat. "Alara," he said. Not a greeting, a statement of possession. Clara found her voice. "Lord Hale." "This is quite the production." Rowan walked toward them slowly, controlled anger radiating from every movement. "Sneaking onto my property, attempting to steal household records, enlisting my own servants in schemes against me. I wasn't—" Mrs. Calloway confessed everything, under duress, admittedly, but she did confess. Rowan's smile was terrible. "Apparently you've been corresponding with several members of my staff, trying to convince them to lie about our marriage in court proceedings. I asked them to tell the truth, your truth, which has very little to do with reality." He was close now, close enough that Clara could see the carefully banked rage in his eyes. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I'd just let you hide away in the countryside, spreading slander and filing petitions?" Pharaoh shifted in his seat, hand moving towards something in his coat. Rowan's gaze flicked to him. "I wouldn't," Rowan said mildly. "I have 6 men positioned in these woods. Whatever you're reaching for, you won't get the chance to use it." Clara's mind raced. 6 men. They were surrounded, trapped. "What do you want?" she asked. "For you to stop this nonsense, sign the annulment papers, accept the settlement, disappear quietly." Rowan's expression was almost reasonable. "That's all I've ever wanted. But you forced my hand with these absurd legal filings and accusations." "Absurd," Clara repeated. Something hot and sharp cut through her fear. 2 years of isolation and neglect is absurd? 2 years of providing you with shelter, status, and material comfort, while you failed to fulfill your one obligation. I'm pregnant. The words fell into silence like stones into deep water. Rowan froze. Behind him, even Hollins looked shocked. You're lying, Rowan said finally. I'm not. Clara climbed down from the cart, ignoring Pharaoh's whispered protest. 3 months along, your heir, the one you declared me incapable of producing. She watched the information land, watched him recalculate. His face went through several expressions, disbelief, calculation, something that might have been triumph, before settling back into rigid control. If that's true, it is. Then the annulment is void. You'll return to Iron Ridge immediately. No. Rowan blinked. I beg your pardon? I said no. Clara's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed steady. I'm not returning. I'm not signing anything. And if you try to force me, I'll make sure every court in the country knows exactly how you treated me. Separate bedrooms, physician examinations, your complete failure as a husband in every meaningful way. You wouldn't dare. I already have. Mrs. Pembroke has depositions, witnesses, evidence. It wasn't entirely true, but Rowan didn't know that. The only reason I'm standing here instead of letting you discover all of this in court is because I'm giving you one chance to walk away with your pride intact. My pride? Rowan's voice went dangerously quiet. You think this is about pride? I think this is about control. You're furious because I stopped being controllable. Clara took a step forward, driven by something reckless and fierce. But here's the thing, Rowan. You never actually had control. You just had my compliance, and I'm done giving you that. If you're carrying my child, I'm carrying a child. Whether it's yours legally will depend entirely on what you do next. She saw him process the implication that she could claim abandonment, name another father, create enough legal murkiness to tie up his heir in court proceedings for years. It was a bluff, mostly, but Rowan didn't know how much she knew about estate law, what loopholes existed. What do you want? He asked finally. Full withdrawal of all annulment proceedings, a legal settlement granting me permanent separation with independent custody of any children, and a written statement that I left Iron Ridge of my own accord with your blessing. That's insane. That's my offer. Take it or see me in court, where I'll make very sure everyone knows why your first wife couldn't bear to stay under your roof. Rowan's jaw worked. She could practically see him weighing options, his reputation, his heir, his control. Behind him, Hollins was watching with something like amazement. I need proof, Rowan said finally, that you're actually pregnant. Clara almost laughed. You'll have it in 6 months when the child is born. Until then, you can choose to believe me or not. But my offer expires the moment I leave this road. You're bluffing. Am I? She held his gaze, channeling every ounce of aristocratic certainty she'd learned from watching him. Try me. For a long, terrible moment, she thought he'd call her bluff, that he'd signal his men to grab her, to drag her back to Iron Ridge by force. Then Rowan exhaled slowly and took a step back. I'll have my solicitor draw up papers, he said, voice clipped and cold. The settlement will be adequate. But Clara, if you're lying about this pregnancy, I'm not. Then I will make the rest of your life a legal nightmare. Do you understand? Perfectly. He climbed back into his cart. Hollins flicked the reins, and they pulled away, leaving the road clear. Clara didn't move until they disappeared from sight. Then her legs gave out entirely. Pharaoh caught her before she hit the ground. Easy. You're all right. You did it. Did I? Clara felt disconnected from her own body, adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow. I just threatened him with his own heir. You negotiated. There's a difference. Pharaoh helped her back into their cart. Now, let's get out of here before he changes his mind. They drove in silence for the first hour. Clara's hands eventually stopped shaking. Her breathing evened out, but her mind kept replaying the confrontation, analyzing every word, every expression. She'd won. Maybe. If Rowan kept his word. If the legal documents actually materialized. If he didn't find some loophole to exploit. If. You know he'll try something, Pharaoh said eventually, as if reading her thoughts. Men like that don't just accept defeat. I know. So what's your plan? Clara looked out at the darkening landscape. Survive. Raise this child. Build a life that's actually mine. She touched her stomach. And hope that's enough. They arrived back at Thorn House after dark. Margaret met them at the door, face pale with worry that shifted to relief when she saw Clara. Thank the... She caught herself. You're safe. What happened? Clara told her everything. The trap at the bridge, the confrontation on the road, the deal she'd offered Rowan. When she finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. You took an enormous risk, her aunt said finally. I know. Using the pregnancy as leverage could backfire spectacularly. I know that too. And you did it anyway. Margaret's expression was impossible to read. Either you're incredibly brave or incredibly reckless. Probably both, Clara said. She felt exhausted down to her bones, the kind of tired that sleep wouldn't fix. Margaret, if he doesn't honor the agreement, if he comes after me anyway, then we'll deal with it. Margaret pulled Clara into a fierce hug. But tonight, you rest. Tomorrow, we can worry about next moves. Clara went to her room and collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. She should change, should eat something, should start planning contingencies for when Rowan inevitably broke his word. But her body had other ideas. Within minutes, she was asleep. She woke to pounding on the front door. Disoriented, Clara checked the window. Still dark, maybe 3 a.m. More pounding, urgent and relentless. Margaret's voice from downstairs, sharp with alarm. Who's there? Clara threw on a robe and stumbled to the landing. Below, Margaret was arguing with someone through the door. Open up! Official business! Clara's heart stopped. She recognized that voice, one of Rowan's men from the bridge. Do you have a warrant? Margaret demanded. Don't need one. We're conducting a search for stolen property. Lord Hale's household records were taken this afternoon. We have reason to believe they're on these premises. That's absurd. Step aside, ma'am, or we'll be forced to enter by other means. Margaret looked up, met Clara's eyes across the dark space. In that moment, Clara understood. Rowan hadn't kept his word. He'd never intended to. The confrontation on the road had been theater, buying him time to set this in motion. He was going to search the house. And if they found anything, any evidence of her correspondence with his servants, any documents from Mrs. Pembroke, anything at all, he could use it to paint her as a thief. Unstable. Criminal. The commitment proceedings would be a formality after that. Margaret mouthed 2 words, second floor. Clara ran. The second-floor hallway stretched dark and unfamiliar in the pre-dawn shadows. Clara's bare feet slapped against cold wood as she ran, brain frantically cataloging what Rowan's men might find. Her correspondence with the servants, locked in Margaret's desk downstairs. Mrs. Pembroke's legal drafts, same place. The letters, the documents, everything that could prove she'd been building a case. Behind her, the sound of splintering wood. They'd broken through the door. Margaret's voice rose in protest, then cut off abruptly. Clara's chest constricted with fear, but she kept moving. The workshop. Margaret had said second floor, and the workshop was... She burst through the door into the binding room, moonlight streaming through tall windows across tables covered in tools and half-restored manuscripts. For a second, she just stood there, breathing hard, mind blank with panic. Then she saw it. The medieval prayer book Margaret had shown her weeks ago. Still sitting on the corner workbench, its damaged pages spread carefully across blotting paper. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. Men's voices, harsh and efficient. Check every room. Anything that looks like documents, you bring to me. Clara grabbed the prayer book, her hands moving with the muscle memory she'd developed over weeks of restoration work. The pages were fragile, some still stuck together with centuries-old water damage. She peeled one section open carefully, revealing the tiny gap between vellum layers. Perfect. She pulled Mrs. Pembroke's most damaging depositions from inside her robe. She'd been sleeping with them under her pillow, paranoid about losing them, and began sliding the thin pages between the stuck-together sections of the ancient manuscript. The modern paper disappeared almost completely, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The door slammed open. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, the shorter one from the shepherd's rest, the one with nervous energy. His eyes swept the room, landing on Clara. What are you doing? Working. Clara forced her voice steady, gesturing to the table covered in restoration tools. Some of us don't sleep much. He moved closer, suspicious. Working on what? A 13th century prayer book, water damaged. The client is paying triple rate, so I've been putting in extra hours. She met his gaze directly. Would you like to inspect it? Fair warning, if you damage any pages, you're personally liable for about £300 worth of restoration work. The number made him hesitate. Lord Hale said you might have documents, stolen property. Do I look like I'm hiding documents? Clara spread her arms, letting him see she wore only a nightgown and robe. I'm a bookbinder's apprentice. This is what I do. His eyes went to the manuscript. What's that made of? Vellum, calfskin most likely. The illuminations are gold leaf and natural pigments, lapis lazuli for the blue. You can tell by the depth of color. She was babbling now, using every scrap of knowledge Margaret had taught her. The binding was originally wooden boards covered in leather, but the boards have separated from the spine, and the leather has deteriorated to the point where, enough, he held up a hand. I don't need a bloody lecture. Then perhaps you should finish your search elsewhere. Some of these pages are irreplaceable, and I'd rather not have them contaminated by... She let her gaze drift pointedly to his muddy boots. The man's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. We'll be checking the rest of the house. Don't go anywhere. The moment he left, Clara's knees nearly gave out. She sat heavily, hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table. That had been close, too close. But it had worked. She listened to the sounds of systematic destruction drifting up from below. Drawers being yanked open, furniture moved. Margaret's careful organization demolished by men looking for evidence that didn't exist, at least not where they were searching. 20 minutes crawled by, then 30. Finally, footsteps retreated toward the front door. Voices in terse conversation, the sound of horses being mounted. Then silence. Clara waited another 10 minutes before she dared move. When she finally crept downstairs, she found Margaret in the sitting room surrounded by chaos. Books pulled from shelves, cushions sliced open, the contents of every drawer scattered across the floor. Her aunt stood in the middle of it all, face pale but composed, a cut on her forehead bleeding sluggishly. Margaret, Clara rushed forward. I'm fine. They got a bit enthusiastic when I objected to them destroying my writing desk. Margaret touched the cut gingerly. But they're gone, and they didn't find what they were looking for, I assume? It's hidden, in the prayer book. A ghost of a smile crossed Margaret's face. Clever. Your mother would have been proud. Clara looked around at the devastation. I'm so sorry. This is my fault, and this is Rowan's fault. Margaret's voice was steel. And this? She gestured at the destroyed room. This was a mistake on his part. How is this a mistake? He just demonstrated exactly how far he's willing to go. Exactly. And he did it in front of witnesses. Margaret moved to the window, wincing slightly. Mrs. Dawes and Mr. Farrow saw everything. So did my neighbor, Mrs. Blackwood, who I'm quite certain is peering through her curtains as we speak. Rowan just gave us documentation of harassment, illegal search, and destruction of property. Clara stared. You're going to use this against him. We're going to use this against him, but first... Margaret grabbed Clara's hand. We're going to make sure you're safe. If Rowan's willing to send thugs to break down doors at 3 a.m, he's past the point of reason. You can't stay here. Where would I go? I have friends. People who owe me favors and don't ask questions. Margaret was already moving, pulling a cloak from the ruined coat closet. There's a cottage about 15 miles north, remote. The owner travels frequently. You can stay there until... No. Clara planted her feet. I'm done running. Clara, this isn't about pride. It's not about pride. It's about the fact that I'll spend the rest of my life running if I don't stop now. Clara's voice cracked but held. He'll keep coming, keep pushing, unless we make him stop. And how exactly do you propose we do that? By going on the offensive. The idea was forming even as Clara spoke, reckless and possibly insane. He thinks I'm hiding, afraid, desperate. What if I'm not? Margaret's eyes narrowed. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Rowan's entire strategy depends on me being invisible. A quiet scandal he can manage. But what if I'm loud instead? Clara's mind was racing now, pieces clicking together. What if I file a formal complaint about tonight's break-in? What if I give an interview to the county newspaper about my experiences at Iron Ridge? What if I make myself so publicly visible that any move he makes against me becomes news? That would be, Margaret paused, actually rather brilliant and completely terrifying. Will it work? It might, or it might provoke him into something worse. Margaret studied her niece. You understand that once you go public, there's no taking it back? Your privacy, your dignity, every detail of your marriage, it all becomes fodder for gossip and speculation. My privacy is already destroyed, my dignity is questionable at best. And the details of my marriage? Clara laughed, sharp and humorless. Let them gossip. Let them speculate. At least they'll be talking about the truth instead of whatever fiction Rowan invents. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. All right, but we do this carefully, strategically. Mrs. Pembroke needs to be involved. She'll know how to frame the narrative legally. And we'll need to move fast before Rowan realizes what we're doing and tries to shut it down. They spent what remained of the night planning. By dawn, they had a strategy that was equal parts legal maneuvering and public relations campaign. Mrs. Pembroke arrived at 7, took one look at the destroyed sitting room and smiled grimly. Perfect, she said. I was hoping for documented evidence of harassment. This exceeds expectations. He sent men to break into my home at 3 in the morning, Margaret said dryly. I aim to please. We'll file a formal complaint with the magistrate today. Include witness statements from your household staff and the neighbor. While that's processing, Clara gives an interview to Mrs. Pembroke consulted her notes. The Northern Herald. It's a small paper but well respected. The editor, Samuel Cortland, is known for taking on stories about abuse of power. Will he actually print it? Clara asked. If you're willing to use your real name and provide verifiable details, absolutely. This is the kind of story that sells papers. Mrs. Pembroke's expression was frank. It'll be ugly. People will judge you harshly for leaving your husband, for speaking publicly, for not being a perfect victim. Can you handle that? Clara thought about the last 3 months. The fear, the hiding, the constant looking over her shoulder. I can handle it better than I can handle another 3 in the morning raid. Good. Mrs. Pembroke stood. Then let's burn Rowan Hale's carefully constructed world to the ground. The interview happened that afternoon, in Margaret's destroyed sitting room. Samuel Cortland was younger than Clara expected, maybe 30, with ink-stained fingers and sharp, intelligent eyes. He brought a photographer who spent 10 minutes capturing images of the sliced cushions, the broken desk, the general devastation. This will run front page, Cortland said, making notes, but I need your story, all of it. And Clara, may I call you Clara? Please. Clara, I need you to understand that once this prints, you become public property. People will have opinions about every choice you've made. They'll question your motives, your character, your version of events. Are you prepared for that? No, Clara said honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. Cortland's smile was approving. Good answer. Let's begin. For 2 hours she talked. About meeting Rowan, about the wedding that had felt more like a business transaction than a celebration. About Iron Ridge's cold halls and colder master. About separate bedrooms and clinical physicians and 2 years of systematic erasure. Cortland took notes in rapid shorthand, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made Clara's stomach turn. When you say he examined you like livestock, can you be more specific? Did he ever explicitly state that you were deficient, or was that implied? How many servants would have witnessed these separate sleeping arrangements? She answered everything, feeling stripped bare but also strangely liberated. The truth, spoken aloud in Margaret's sitting room, lost some of its power to shame her. These were facts, things that had happened. She wasn't inventing them or exaggerating them. They were simply real. When she finished, Cortland set down his pen and looked at her with something like respect. That's quite a story. It's my life. And you're certain you want it printed? Once it's out there, I'm certain. Clara's hand drifted to her stomach. She was showing now, unmistakably. I'm not just fighting for myself anymore. Cortland's gaze followed the gesture. His eyebrows rose. Is that relevant to the story? Yes, I'm pregnant, 3 months along. Which makes Rowan's claim that I'm barren particularly interesting, don't you think? My editor is going to love this, Cortland muttered, already scribbling notes. When were you planning to? Now, today, in your article. Clara felt reckless, powerful. Let him read about it in the paper like everyone else. The Northern Herald hit stands 2 days later. The headline was everything Mrs. Pembroke could have hoped for. Aristocrat's wife speaks. Marriage of isolation, neglect, and false accusations. Below it, a photograph of Margaret's destroyed sitting room and another of Clara herself, pale, visibly pregnant, standing amid the wreckage. The article pulled no punches. Cortland had quoted her extensively, included statements from Margaret and Mrs. Dawes about the illegal search, and ended with a pointed question. If Lord Hale was so certain of his wife's inadequacy, why did he feel compelled to send armed men to break into a private residence at 3 a.m? Margaret bought every copy the local shop had. It's going to spread, she said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. Cortland sent advance copies to papers in the southern counties. By tomorrow, half of England will know Rowan Hale's name for all the wrong reasons. Clara stared at her own face in newsprint, feeling disconnected from the woman in the photograph. That person looked brave, certain, nothing like how she felt inside. What happens now? She asked. Now we wait and see how Rowan responds. The response came faster than expected. By evening, a formal letter arrived from Rowan's solicitor. Not the same one who drafted the annulment papers, Clara noticed. Someone new. Someone who used very careful language to express Lord Hale's deep concern over inflammatory and defamatory statements published without his opportunity to respond. He's threatening libel charges, Mrs. Pembroke said, reading the letter with obvious satisfaction, which is exactly what I hoped for. How is that good? Clara asked. Because libel requires him to prove your statements were false, which means he'd have to argue in open court that he didn't keep separate bedrooms, didn't bring in physicians to examine you, didn't send men to raid this house. Mrs. Pembroke's smile was sharp. Every claim he disputes becomes evidence we can subpoena, witnesses we can call. He'd be putting his entire private life on trial. So what will he do instead? Probably try to settle quietly, offer you enough money to retract the story, and disappear. But Rowan didn't offer settlement. 3 days after the article ran, a different paper published a response. An interview with Lord Rowan Hale himself, positioned as the wronged party. Clara read it in Margaret's kitchen, fury building with each paragraph. Rowan painted himself as the victim of a manipulative, unstable wife who'd grown irrational when faced with her own inadequacies. He claimed she'd left without warning, ignored generous settlement offers, and now was spreading lies to cover her own failures. He's calling me delusional, Clara said, voice shaking, saying the pregnancy is either invented or… She couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was clear, that the child wasn't his. He's panicking, Margaret said, and panic makes people sloppy. This doesn't look like panic. This looks like character assassination. Read the last paragraph. Clara scanned down. The reporter had asked Rowan about the raid on Margaret's house. His response, I have no knowledge of any such incident. If overzealous servants acting on their own initiative caused property damage, I sincerely apologize and will of course provide appropriate compensation. He's lying, Claire said flatly. Obviously, but he's also just denied giving the orders. Mrs. Pembroke, who'd arrived an hour earlier, tapped the paper, which means those overzealous servants might be willing to testify otherwise. People don't like being thrown under carts to protect their employers. You think they'd turn on him? I think they'd consider it, especially if we make it worth their while. Mrs. Pembroke pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Time to start making offers. Legal protection in exchange for testimony. What do you think those men would say if we guaranteed they wouldn't face criminal charges for breaking and entering? Over the next week, the story took on a life of its own. Other papers picked it up, some supporting Clara, others defending Rowan. Society columns debated proper wifely behavior and aristocratic obligations. Letters to editors flooded in from women who'd experienced similar marriages, their stories ranging from heartbreaking to horrifying. Clara found herself at the center of a controversy she'd never intended to start. You've become a symbol, Margaret said, showing her another stack of letters. These addressed directly to Clara, care of the Northern Herald. Women are writing to thank you, to share their own experiences, to tell you you're not alone. Clara read through them with tears streaming down her face. A woman from Kent, whose husband had locked her in her room for a week to cure her hysteria. A widow from Sussex who'd finally escaped after 15 years of systematic cruelty. A young bride who was contemplating leaving and wanted advice on how to survive it. I don't know what to tell them, Clara said. I barely know how to survive myself. Tell them the truth, that it's hard, that some days you want to give up, but that you're still here, still fighting, and that matters. Margaret squeezed her shoulder. You don't have to be perfect to be powerful. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mr. Hollins appeared at Thorn House one gray afternoon, looking uncomfortable and determined. Margaret brought him to the sitting room, restored now, though still missing some furniture, where Clara waited nervously. Miss Alara, Hollins said, then corrected himself. Mrs. Vance, I've come to offer testimony. Clara's heart jumped. Testimony about what? Everything. The separate bedrooms, the way he spoke to you, the orders he gave the night he sent men here. Hollins's hands twisted his hat. I've served the Hale family for 20 years. I thought loyalty meant keeping silent. But then I read what he said in the paper, that he didn't know about the raid, that it was servants acting alone, and I realized he'd throw any of us away to protect himself. He'll destroy you for this, Clara warned. Probably. But my sister reads the Northern Herald. She wrote me, asking if I'd known what was happening to you under that roof, if I'd seen and done nothing. Hollins met Clara's eyes. I can't lie to her, and I can't let him keep lying about you. Mrs. Pembroke materialized from somewhere with papers already prepared. Mr. Hollins, if you're willing to provide a sworn statement, I am, all of it. The statement took hours. Hollins described years of observing Rowan's treatment of Clara. The dismissive comments, the lack of basic courtesy, the night Rowan had ordered the raid on Margaret's house and specifically instructed his men to find anything that makes her look unstable. He said that? Mrs. Pembroke's pen flew across the page. Those exact words? Yes, ma'am. I was standing right there when he gave the orders. When Hollins finished, Mrs. Pembroke had enough material to eviscerate Rowan's entire defense. She filed an amended complaint the next day, this time including Hollins's testimony and a demand for Rowan to appear before a magistrate. Clara waited for retaliation, for Rowan to escalate, to come after her more aggressively. Instead, something unexpected happened, Mrs. Calloway wrote. Not with hidden logs this time, but openly, sending her letter directly to Thorn House. She'd seen Hollins's testimony printed in the Herald and wanted to add her own. 2 of the younger housemaids followed, then the head gardener, then, surprisingly, Rowan's own solicitor, the original one who'd drafted the annulment papers, submitted a resignation letter that included pointed commentary about being asked to pursue legally questionable strategies. The defection was becoming a flood. He's losing control of his own household, Margaret observed, reading through the latest batch of letters. Everything he built on silence and intimidation is collapsing now that people see they're not alone in speaking up. Clara felt almost dizzy with it. I never meant to burn down an entire social structure. No, you just meant to survive. But survival, when it's public and unapologetic, tends to give other people permission to survive too. The magistrate hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In the interim, Clara tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She worked in the binding workshop, her pregnancy making some tasks difficult but not impossible. She read letters from strangers and tried to craft responses that were honest without being preachy. She prepared for the possibility that despite everything, Rowan might still win. 1 week before the hearing, a different kind of letter arrived. It was from a physician, not one Rowan had hired, but an independent doctor who specialized in women's health. He'd read about the case and wanted to offer his services as an expert witness. I've examined countless women declared barren by their husbands' physicians, the letter read. In my professional experience, the fault lies with the husband's approach at least as often as with any female inadequacy. I would be willing to testify to this effect. Mrs. Pembroke nearly crowed with delight. This is perfect. This completely undermines Rowan's entire premise. Will the magistrate allow it? Clara asked. If we frame it correctly? Absolutely. This isn't just about your marriage anymore. It's about the broader question of how marital failure is assessed and assigned. Mrs. Pembroke was already drafting motions. Rowan wanted to make this about your deficiency. Instead, we're making it about his. The night before the hearing, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom window, watching snow fall over Margaret's gardens, one hand on her now prominent belly. The baby had started moving, small flutters that felt like hope and terror in equal measure. We're going to be all right, she whispered to the life growing inside her. One way or another. A knock on the door. Margaret entered carrying 2 glasses of warm milk laced with honey. Couldn't sleep either? Her aunt asked. Too much thinking. They sat together in comfortable silence, drinking milk and watching the snow. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already won." Clara looked at her in surprise. "How do you figure that?" "Because you stopped letting someone else define your worth. You stopped accepting their version of reality as the only truth that mattered." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Win or lose the legal battle, you've reclaimed yourself. That's not nothing. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. But Clara," Margaret waited until Clara met her eyes. "Your mother would have been so proud of who you've become." The tears came then, hard and cleansing. Clara cried for her mother, for her lost years at Iron Ridge, for the girl she'd been who thought love and marriage were the same thing. She cried for every woman who'd written to her with their own stories of survival. And then she stopped crying, dried her face, and slept. The courthouse was smaller than Clara expected, a gray stone building in the county seat, imposing but not overwhelming. Mrs. Pembroke met them at the entrance, flanked by Hollins, Mrs. Calloway, and 3 other former Iron Ridge servants who'd agreed to testify. "Ready?" Mrs. Pembroke asked. Clara smoothed her dress over her pregnant belly. She'd chosen to wear something that made her condition obvious, refusing to hide it any longer. "Ready?" Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Apparently news of the hearing had spread, drawing spectators from across the region. Clara saw women she recognized from the letters they'd sent, present to watch the proceedings. Saw journalists scribbling notes. Saw, in the back row, Samuel Cortland from the Northern Herald. And at the front, surrounded by 3 solicitors and radiating cold fury, sat Rowan. Their eyes met across the room. His expression was unreadable, carefully controlled. But Clara saw something flicker there, uncertainty, maybe, or fear. She smiled. The magistrate entered, and everyone rose. The hearing began. Mrs. Pembroke was brilliant. She systematically dismantled every claim Rowan had made, calling witness after witness to contradict his version of events. Hollins described the separate bedrooms. Mrs. Calloway produced her household logs, showing a pattern of isolation and neglect. The physician testified about the absurdity of declaring a woman barren after only 2 years of sporadic intimacy. Rowan's solicitors tried to object, to redirect, to poke holes in the testimony. But every time they thought they'd found an opening, Mrs. Pembroke closed it with documentation or another witness. And then it was Clara's turn. She walked to the witness stand on shaking legs, very aware of every eye in the room on her pregnant form. The magistrate, a stern older man with kind eyes, gestured for her to sit. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "you've made some serious accusations against your husband. I'd like to hear in your own words why you left Iron Ridge Manor." Clara took a breath. Then she told the truth. Not the sanitized version from the newspaper article. The whole truth. The loneliness that felt like suffocation, the slow erosion of her sense of self, the morning she'd realized she was pregnant and understood she had a choice. Leave or stay. Die slowly or live dangerously. "I chose to live," she said simply, "even if it meant losing everything else." "And the child?" the magistrate asked gently. "You're quite certain it's Lord Hale's?" "Given that I was a virgin when I married him and haven't been with any other man since, yes, I'm certain." Clara's voice was steady. "The child is legally his heir, which is probably why he's so desperate to discredit me before anyone starts asking why he was so quick to declare me barren." Rowan's solicitor shot to his feet. "Objection! That's pure speculation." "Is it?" Clara looked directly at Rowan. Then perhaps Lord Hale could explain why he filed annulment papers claiming non-consummation 1 week before I fled Iron Ridge, when any physician could confirm that I was already 2 months pregnant at the time. The courtroom erupted. The magistrate banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Rowan's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed defense crumbling visibly. The journalists were scribbling frantically. "Lord Hale," the magistrate said when quiet finally returned, "do you have a response to this allegation?" Rowan stood slowly. For a long moment he just looked at Clara, and she saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. He could deny it, try to fight, drag this out further, or he could cut his losses. "I may have been premature in my assessment of the situation," he said finally, voice tight. If Mrs. Vance was indeed with child at the time of the annulment filing, then obviously that changes the circumstances. Obviously, the magistrate said dryly. He consulted his notes. Mrs. Vance, what outcome are you seeking from these proceedings? Clara stood facing Rowan across the courtroom. Legal separation with independent custody. No claim on the child's inheritance rights until they reach majority. And a formal withdrawal of all allegations regarding my mental state or character. That's, Rowan's solicitor started. Reasonable, the magistrate interrupted. Given the evidence presented, Lord Hale, I strongly suggest you accept these terms. The alternative is a full trial, which I suspect would not go well for you. Rowan's jaw worked. Clara could see him fighting it, hating every second of this public humiliation. I accept, he said finally. With one condition. Everyone waited. The child bears my name, legally recognized as my heir. Nothing else changes, but that is non-negotiable. Clara considered it. The name Hale had never brought her anything but pain. But for her child, it meant inheritance, status, protection. And really, what did she care what name they carried, as long as they grew up free? Agreed, she said. The magistrate nodded. Then I'll draw up the settlement documents. This hearing is concluded. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. Clara walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight, Margaret on one side and Mrs. Pembroke on the other. Behind them she could hear the buzz of conversation, journalists shouting questions, Rowan's solicitors arguing about next steps. She didn't look back. You did it, Margaret said quietly. You actually did it. We did it, Clara corrected. Then she stopped walking, right there in the middle of the courthouse steps, and started laughing. Great, gasping laughs that bent her double, made her belly ache, brought tears streaming down her face. Margaret and Mrs. Pembroke exchanged worried glances. Is she all right? Mrs. Pembroke asked. I'm fine, Clara managed between laughs. I'm free. I'm actually free. And she was. No more running, no more hiding, no more letting someone else write the story of her life. She was Clara Vance, pregnant and separated and scandalous. She had a small room in her aunt's house, a growing skill at book restoration, and a child on the way who would never know what it felt like to be invisible. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she was young and hopeful. It was better. It was better. The thought kept returning as Clara navigated the following weeks, unexpected and stubborn, pushing through moments of doubt and exhaustion. Better than what she'd had. Better than what she'd thought possible. The settlement documents arrived within 5 days, drawn up with the cold precision of legal language that turned human suffering into contractual clauses. Clara read through them in Margaret's study, Mrs. Pembroke seated across from her, translating the more arcane terminology. Standard separation agreement, Mrs. Pembroke said, pointing to a dense paragraph. You maintain independent residence with no obligation to cohabitate. He retains the Hale name and estate. You retain autonomy over your person and choices. And the child? Legally recognized as his heir. He has visitation rights once the child reaches age 5, but no custodial authority until they reach majority at 21. You have sole decision-making power over education, health, religious upbringing, everything that matters. Mrs. Pembroke looked up. It's actually more favorable than I expected. He must want this finished. Clara signed her name at the bottom, a bold, clear signature that looked nothing like the timid script she'd used on her marriage certificate 2 years ago. Different woman, different life. What happens now? She asked. Now? Mrs. Pembroke gathered the papers. Now you live. Build something. Figure out what comes next. What came next, initially, was the baby. Clara's pregnancy progressed through spring with the kind of mundane difficulties no one warned you about. Swollen ankles, persistent heartburn, the inability to find a comfortable sleeping position. Margaret, who'd never had children herself, became surprisingly maternal, fussing over Clara's diet and insisting she rest more than she worked. You're carrying precious cargo, Margaret said one afternoon, physically removing tools from Clara's hands when she'd been binding books for 6 hours straight. The manuscripts will still be here tomorrow. So will the baby. I need to finish this commission before what? Before you go into labor at the workbench and ruin a 15th century psalter with amniotic fluid? Margaret steered her toward a chair. Sit, Read. Do something that doesn't require manual dexterity. Clara sat, mostly because standing had become exhausting. Through the workshop window, she could see the gardens blooming, Margaret's prized roses, the wild tangle of herbs, early summer vegetables beginning to sprout, life insisting on itself everywhere she looked. The Northern Herald had run a follow-up piece after the settlement, positioning Clara as a symbol of changing times. Women's rights advocates had written her name into their pamphlets. She'd received 3 marriage proposals from men she'd never met, all of which she'd burned without responding. One wealthy widow had offered to fund a school for women learning bookbinding if Clara would consider teaching. It was overwhelming, flattering, completely absurd. "I'm not a symbol," Clara told Margaret one evening, showing her the latest letter, this one from a suffragist organization in London inviting her to speak at a rally. "I'm just someone who left a bad situation. You're someone who left publicly and won. That makes you dangerous to people invested in keeping women quiet." Margaret studied the invitation. "Are you going to go? To London? In my condition?" Clara gestured at her very pregnant belly. "I can barely walk to the village without needing to sit down." "After the baby, then. You should consider it." "I don't know what I'd say. Hello, I survived?" That's not exactly inspiring. "It's more inspiring than you think." Margaret set the letter aside. "But that's a problem for future Clara. Present Clara needs to focus on not giving birth in my workshop. The baby came on a Tuesday in late June, 3 weeks earlier than expected, and with enough drama to make up for the premature timing." Clara's water broke while she was sorting through restoration requests at Margaret's desk. One moment she was reading a letter about water-damaged diaries. The next she was standing in a puddle, contractions hitting hard and fast. "Margaret," she called, trying to keep panic out of her voice. Her aunt appeared instantly, took one look at the situation, and shifted into terrifying efficiency. "Right. Mrs. Dawes, fetch the midwife. Pharaoh, heat water. Clara, stop standing there like you've never seen bodily fluids before and get upstairs." The labor lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of pain that made every previous hardship feel quaint by comparison. Clara had thought she understood suffering, had survived Iron Ridge's emotional cruelty, endured pregnancy's physical toll, weathered the legal battle's mental exhaustion. But this was different. This was her body being torn apart from the inside, remaking itself into something new, and there was nothing dignified or symbolic about it. She screamed, she swore, she told Margaret she'd changed her mind about the whole thing and wanted to return the baby immediately. "Not how it works," Margaret said, gripping Clara's hand hard enough to hurt. "You're doing fine. Just breathe." "I can't." "You can. You will, because you've survived worse, and this actually has an end point." The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who delivered half the county, was less sympathetic. "Stop whining and push. The baby won't birth itself." Clara pushed, and when she thought she had nothing left, she pushed again. And then, sound, a thin, reedy cry that cut through Clara's exhaustion like light through fog. Mrs. Fletcher lifted a tiny, furious creature, all red face and flailing limbs. "It's a boy," she announced. "Healthy lungs, all his fingers and toes. Congratulations, Mrs. Vance." They placed him on Clara's chest, warm and impossibly small, covered in vernix and blood and other substances she didn't want to examine too closely. He stopped crying the moment he touched her skin, making small, snuffling sounds instead. Clara stared at him, this person who'd been abstract for months, and was now undeniably real. He had dark hair plastered to his scalp, eyes that couldn't quite focus yet but seemed to be searching for something, tiny hands that gripped her finger with surprising strength. "Hello," she whispered. "I'm your mother." It felt inadequate. Every word she knew felt inadequate for this moment. Margaret appeared at her shoulder, looking uncharacteristically emotional. "He's perfect." "He's a mess," Clara said, but she was crying too. "Look at him." "I am looking. Perfect mess." They stayed like that for a while. Clara, Margaret, and the baby, who'd somehow survived everything Clara had put him through. Mrs. Fletcher bustled around cleaning up, offering occasional instructions about nursing and afterbirth that Clara barely registered. Eventually, Mrs. Dawes appeared with warm cloths and practical advice about getting both mother and child cleaned up. Clara let herself be tended to, too exhausted to object, while Margaret held the baby with surprising competence. "What are you naming him?" Mrs. Dawes asked. Clara hadn't thought about it. had deliberately avoided thinking about it, superstitious that naming him before he arrived might jinx something. But now, looking at his scrunched face and listening to his breathing, the name came easily. "Thomas," she said, "after my father." "Thomas Hale," Margaret said, testing it. "Strong name. Just Thomas for now. He can decide about the rest when he's older." Clara reached for him and Margaret handed him over carefully. He fit perfectly in the crook of her arm, like he'd been designed for that exact space. "Right now, he's just mine." The first month passed in a blur of sleeplessness and wonder. Thomas had opinions about everything. When he wanted to eat, how he preferred to be held, which lullabies were acceptable, and which were clearly offensive to infant sensibilities. Clara learned his rhythms through trial and error, often with Margaret's sardonic commentary. "He's got your stubborn streak," her aunt observed one midnight when Thomas was refusing sleep despite obvious exhaustion. "He's 3 weeks old. How can you possibly know that? Look at his face. That's determination right there." Clara looked. Thomas was indeed scowling with the intensity of someone who had important baby business to attend to and resented being interrupted by the need for rest. "He gets that from you," she told him. "My stubbornness comes from surviving. Yours is just pure personality." He responded by falling immediately asleep, as if to prove he'd only been awake because he chose to be. Despite the exhaustion, Clara found herself happier than she could remember being. The binding work continued when Thomas slept. She'd taken on 2 apprentices, young women from the village who showed aptitude for the meticulous restoration work. Margaret's business was growing, fueled partly by publicity from the trial and partly by genuine skill. They'd restored the medieval prayer book, the one that had hidden Clara's documents during the raid. The client had been thrilled with the results and recommended them to colleagues. More commissions followed. Clara found she had a particular talent for the most damaged works, the ones other binders deemed hopeless. "You see possibility where others see ruin," one client told her, picking up a restored family Bible that had been through a house fire. "It's a rare gift." Clara thought about that later, nursing Thomas in the quiet workshop, seeing possibility in ruin. Maybe that's what she'd done with her own life. Looked at the wreckage of her marriage and found something salvageable underneath. Not the relationship itself, but herself. The person she'd been before Iron Ridge tried to erase her. Summer turned to autumn. Thomas grew, hitting milestones that Margaret meticulously recorded in a journal, despite Clara's protests that it was excessive. "He smiled today," Margaret would announce. "That's significant. He also spit up on my shoulder 3 times. Should we record that too?" "Don't be ridiculous. The shoulder incidents aren't developmentally relevant." They fell into comfortable rhythms, work and childcare, and the small domestic details that made up a life. Claire had stopped checking the papers for news of Rowan, stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. He'd sent the legally required financial support for Thomas, but no personal communication. Fine by her. The less she thought about Iron Ridge, the more it faded into something that had happened to someone else. Then, in October, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was from Mr. Hollins, forwarded through Mrs. Pembroke to maintain discretion. Clara read it in the workshop while Thomas napped nearby in his basket. "Dear Mrs. Vance, I hope this letter finds you and the child well. I'm writing with news I thought you should hear directly rather than through gossip. Lord Hale is remarrying. The engagement was announced last week, a young woman from a prominent family, very suitable by society's standards. The wedding is planned for spring. I thought you'd want to know. Respectfully, J. Hollins." Clara read it twice, waiting for some emotional response. Anger, maybe, or hurt, or vindication. What she felt was relief. "He's moving on," she said aloud, and the words tasted like freedom. Margaret looked up from her own work. "Who is?" "Rowan. He's getting married." Her aunt's eyebrows rose. "Fast work. You've been separated less than a year. He needs an heir, or thinks he does." Clara folded the letter carefully. "Poor girl. Whoever she is. Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine." Clara looked at Thomas, sleeping peacefully despite the magnitude of news being discussed nearby. "He can do whatever he wants. It doesn't touch us anymore." And it didn't. That was the revelation. Rowan's choices, his life, his future wife. None of it affected Clara's reality. She had her own orbit now, separate and stable. But 3 weeks later, another letter came. This one directly from Rowan, in his precise handwriting. Elara, given my upcoming nuptials, certain matters require resolution. I would like to meet Thomas. Not as a custodial visit. I'm aware our agreement prohibits that until he's older, but as a courtesy between parents. I understand if you're reluctant, but I'm asking regardless. I can come to Thorn House at your convenience. Rowan. Clara stared at the letter, conflicting emotions warring in her chest. Part of her wanted to refuse outright. Part of her thought it was reasonable. Part of her was just curious about what had changed in the man she'd once been married to. She showed it to Margaret, who read it with her typical skepticism. "What do you want to do?" her aunt asked. "I don't know. He has legal rights to visit eventually. This is just earlier than required, which means it's your choice entirely." Margaret handed the letter back. "So what does your gut tell you?" Clara's gut told her several contradictory things, but underneath them all was a simple truth. She didn't want to spend years dreading Rowan's involvement in Thomas's life. Better to establish terms now, on her ground, when she held all the power. "I'll agree to it," she said. "But here, in the workshop, with you present, and it's 1 hour, no more." She wrote back that same day, her terms clear and non-negotiable. Rowan's response came within 48 hours. Acceptance. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in early November. Clara spent the morning anxious and irritable, snapping at her apprentices and redoing perfectly adequate binding work. Margaret finally physically removed her from the workshop. "You're going to damage something expensive if you keep this up. Go walk. Clear your head. Thomas is asleep and I'm capable of handling an aristocrat's visit." What if nothing? You faced him in court. You can handle an hour in a workshop. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "And if you can't, I'll throw him out. I've been wanting to do that for months anyway." Clara walked the grounds, trying to work out her nerves through physical movement. By the time Rowan's carriage arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, she'd managed to achieve something resembling composure. He looked different. Older, maybe, or just tired. The rigid control he'd always worn like armor seemed slightly loosened. He climbed down from the carriage carefully, glancing around Thornhouse's modest grounds with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. She met him at the door. "Rowan, Elara." He stopped, corrected himself. "Clara, I heard you prefer that now." "I do." Awkward silence. They'd shared a house for 2 years and apparently had nothing to say to each other outside of legal proceedings. Margaret appeared, cutting through the discomfort with characteristic bluntness. "Lord Hale, you're here to meet your son, not stand on the doorstep. Come in." She led them to the workshop where Thomas was awake in his basket, making the gurgling sounds that passed for conversation at 3 months old. Rowan stopped in the doorway, staring. Rowan seemed at a loss for words. "He's real." "What did you think he was?" Clara asked, slightly amused despite herself. "Theoretical?" "I don't know. I hadn't thought about it." Rowan moved closer, his movements careful. "May I?" Clara picked Thomas up, holding him against her shoulder. He grabbed a handful of her hair and yanked enthusiastically. "You can sit. I'll bring him to you." Rowan sat in the chair Margaret indicated, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Clara transferred Thomas to his arms with instructions on supporting the head. Rowan held his son like he was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. Thomas, naturally, chose that moment to smile, a real smile, not just gas, directly at his father. Something in Rowan's expression cracked. "He's perfect. He's colicky and stubborn and hasn't slept through the night since birth," Clara said. "But yes, perfect anyway." Rowan looked up at her, and Clara saw something she'd never seen in their marriage: genuine emotion. Not anger or disappointment or cold calculation, just raw, unguarded feeling. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About everything. About you, about—" He gestured helplessly. "I thought marriage was a transaction, that if I provided properly, did everything correctly according to form, it would work. I didn't understand that people aren't ledgers that balance." Clara sat down in her own work chair, suddenly too tired to stand. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to hear it, and because—" Rowan looked back at Thomas, who'd grabbed his finger and was trying to eat it. Because I don't want him to grow up thinking his father is incapable of admitting mistakes. He won't know you well enough to have opinions about that. Not until he's older. I know. Which is my loss, not his. Rowan's voice was steady, but sad. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm acknowledging that I destroyed something I should have valued. You were never deficient. I was. The words landed in Claire's chest with unexpected weight. She'd won the legal battle, proven him wrong publicly, but this quiet admission in her workshop, with no audience or ulterior motive, somehow meant more. Thank you, she said. Because what else was there to say? They sat in silence for a while, watching Thomas try to grab Rowan's nose. Margaret hovered nearby, not quite trusting, but willing to allow the moment. Eventually, Rowan handed Thomas back. I should go. My fiancée, her name is Catherine. She's nervous about me being here. I promised I'd return by evening. Is she kind? Clara asked. The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Rowan. Yes, very. And patient with my, he gestured vaguely, with my inability to be human sometimes. Good. Clara meant it. I hope you make each other happy. I hope, Rowan paused at the door. I hope you find that too. Happiness. You deserve it more than anyone. After he left, Margaret let out a long breath. Well, that was unexpected. Which part? All of it. I was prepared to physically remove him. Instead, I witnessed something almost resembling personal growth. Margaret looked at Clara curiously. How are you feeling? Clara thought about it. She'd spent months hating Rowan, fearing him, fighting him. And now? Lighter, she said finally. Like I can finally stop caring what happened and just live. Good. Margaret picked up Thomas, who'd started fussing. Because living is what you're best at. Winter came quietly to Thorn House. Clara's binding business thrived. She'd developed a reputation for impossible restorations and had more commissions than she could handle. The apprentices she'd trained were becoming skilled in their own right. Margaret had started teaching occasional classes in the village, sharing techniques with anyone interested in learning. Thomas grew with alarming speed, hitting milestones that made Clara simultaneously proud and panicky. He rolled over at 4 months, started sitting up at 5. By 6 months, he was babbling constantly, carrying on lengthy conversations in a language only he understood. He's going to be brilliant, Margaret declared one evening, watching Thomas attempt to grab a book that was definitely not age-appropriate. Look at that focus. He's trying to eat it, Margaret. Brilliant focus. Clara laughed, feeling something settle deeper into place with each passing day. This was her life now, not the one she'd planned, not the one society expected, but entirely, completely hers. In February, an invitation arrived from the London Suffragist Organization, the same group that had contacted her after the trial. They were hosting a conference on women's rights and wanted Clara to speak about her experience. Say yes, Margaret urged. Thomas is old enough to travel. Mrs. Dawes can help with him during the actual speech. This is important. I'm a bookbinder who got divorced, not a revolutionary. You're a woman who chose herself over convention and lived to tell about it. That's revolutionary whether you like it or not. Clara considered it. The idea of standing in front of a crowd, sharing her story publicly, made her stomach turn. But it also felt like closing a loop, taking the private pain that had become public scandal and transforming it into something useful. All right, she said, I'll do it. The conference was held in a hall that smelled of old wood and new ambition. Women filled every seat, from working-class activists to wealthy patrons, all gathered around the radical idea that they deserved autonomy over their own lives. Clara spoke for 20 minutes, her prepared notes abandoned after the first paragraph. Instead, she told the truth, about Iron Ridge's cold halls and colder master, about discovering her pregnancy and choosing freedom over security, about building a life from scratch with nothing but stubbornness and support from one fearless aunt. I'm not special, she concluded, looking out at hundreds of faces. I just decided that existing on someone else's terms was worse than the risk of existing on my own. And I was lucky enough to have people who helped me survive that risk. Every woman should have that. Not luck, actual structural support, legal rights, financial independence, the ability to leave without losing everything. The applause was thunderous. Afterward, women approached her with stories of their own. Marriages they'd escaped, lives they'd rebuilt, battles they were still fighting. Clara listened to all of them, taking notes when asked, offering what limited advice she could. One young woman, barely 20, grabbed Clara's hand with desperate intensity. "I'm in a situation like yours was, but I don't have an aunt. I don't have anywhere to go." Clara looked at her, at the fear and determination warring in her expression, and made a decision. "Write to me," she said, producing one of the business cards Margaret had insisted on printing. "Thorn House. We're starting a training program for women learning bookbinding. Room and board included while you learn. No questions asked." The woman stared at the card like it was salvation itself. "Truly? Truly?" Margaret, who'd been watching from the side of the hall with Thomas, joined Clara afterward. "A training program? When did we decide that?" "Just now. We have space. We have skills worth teaching. Why not use them?" Clara bounced Thomas on her hip, his happy babbling providing counterpoint to the serious conversation. "We could help people. Actually help, not just talk about it." Margaret's smile was slow and proud. "Your mother would have loved this version of you. This version of me wouldn't exist without you." "Nonsense. I just provided space. You did the work." They took the train back to Thorn House the next day, Clara already making plans for converting the unused East Wing into dormitory space. Margaret contributed ideas about curriculum and funding. Thomas contributed drool and occasional shrieks of infant joy. By spring, they'd accepted their first 3 students, women fleeing bad marriages, bad families, or just bad circumstances. Clara taught them binding techniques while Margaret handled business management. Slowly, carefully, they built something that resembled a community. Rowan's wedding announcement appeared in the papers that April. Clara read it while nursing Thomas, feeling nothing but mild curiosity. The bride looked young and hopeful in the engagement photograph. Clara hoped she'd stay that way. Hoped Rowan had learned enough from their disaster to not repeat it. She sent a gift, a beautifully restored first edition of poetry, something appropriately impersonal and generous. Rowan sent a thank you note that was equally polite and distant. They were learning to exist as separate planets in separate orbits, connected only by the small person currently trying to grab Clara's nose. "Your father got married today," she told Thomas, who responded by blowing a spit bubble. "Somewhere far from here, he's probably making vows and promising forever. I hope he means them this time." Thomas made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a request for food. Clara chose to interpret it as wisdom and fed him accordingly. Summer arrived with its usual abundance. The gardens bloomed, the workshop hummed with activity. Thomas took his first steps in August, staggering between Clara and Margaret with a look of intense concentration that made them both laugh and cry simultaneously. "He's growing up," Margaret said, watching him practice walking with grim determination. "Too fast." They all do. But Clara found she didn't mind the speed as much as she'd expected. Each phase brought new challenges and discoveries. Thomas developed a personality, stubborn like her, curious like everyone, surprisingly gentle with the workshop cats. He'd sit in Clara's lap while she worked on delicate repairs, watching her hands with fascination. "He'll be a binder one day," Margaret predicted. "He'll be whatever he wants," Clara corrected. "That's the point of all this." In October, Rowan sent a letter requesting another visit. Clara agreed more easily this time, the anxiety of the first meeting replaced by simple logistics. He came on a Saturday, bringing small gifts, a wooden horse for Thomas, a rare manuscript for Clara's collection. "Catherine helped me choose them," he admitted. "She has better instincts about these things than I do." They sat in the garden while Thomas attempted to eat leaves under Margaret's supervision. The conversation was easier now, stripped of the weight of their shared history. "How is married life?" Clara asked. "Different. Better, I think. Though I'm probably not the best judge." Rowan watched Thomas destroy a flower with single-minded focus. "Catherine talks to me. Actually talks, not just responds to direct questions. It's disconcerting." Clara laughed. "Communication. Revolutionary concept. I'm learning." He looked at her directly. "She asks about you sometimes. Wants to know if you're well." "Tell her I'm fine. Tell her—" Clara paused, choosing words carefully. "Tell her I hope you make each other happy. Genuinely." "We're trying." Rowan stood to leave, brushing dirt from his trousers. "Thank you for letting me visit, for not making this harder than it needed to be. We're both just trying to do right by him." Clara gestured to Thomas, who'd abandoned the flowers in favor of chasing a butterfly. Everything else is just details. After Rowan left, Margaret joined Clara on the garden bench. He's changed. People do sometimes, given enough reason. And you? Have you changed? Clara thought about the woman who'd fled Iron Ridge in the snow, terrified and pregnant, and convinced she was making the worst mistake of her life. Thought about who she was now, mother, binder, accidental activist, owner of a small but growing business that helped women rebuild their lives. Completely, she said. I'm someone I actually recognize now. The years unfolded with the kind of mundane magic that made up real life. Thomas grew from baby to toddler to small boy with opinions about everything. The training program expanded. They'd helped 15 women by Thomas's 3rd birthday, teaching skills and providing space for healing. Some stayed in the area, starting their own workshops. Others moved on to different lives, carrying their knowledge elsewhere. Clara's binding work gained recognition beyond local circles. Museums contacted her about restoration projects. Private collectors sought her expertise. She wrote a small manual on water damage repair that became required reading for preservation students. Margaret published a book about bookbinding techniques, dedicating it to the women who understand that saving broken things is its own form of revolution. And through it all, Clara built a life that was messy and imperfect and entirely her own. She had bad days when the old fears resurfaced, moments when she wondered if she'd made the right choices, times when single motherhood felt impossibly hard. But she also had good days. Many of them. Days when Thomas laughed so hard at something ridiculous that Clara couldn't help joining in. When a student mastered a difficult technique and looked at her own hands with wonder. When she finished a restoration that everyone else had declared impossible and felt the quiet satisfaction of proving them wrong. On Thomas's 4th birthday, they held a party in the garden. Students past and present attended, along with Margaret's village friends, Mrs. Pembroke, even Mr. Hollins, who'd become an unlikely ally and occasional visitor. Clara watched her son run through the garden, chasing other children and being chased in turn, and felt something settle into place. This was enough. More than enough. This was everything she'd fought for. The right to build a life on her own terms, to raise her child in love instead of obligation, to work that challenged her and community that supported her. Rowan sent a gift, an elaborate wooden train set that Thomas immediately adored. The accompanying note was brief. Happy birthday, Thomas. Your father, simple and honest. They'd found an equilibrium, she and Rowan, not friendship exactly, but something functional and respectful. That evening, after the party ended and Thomas fell asleep covered in cake frosting and happiness, Clara sat in the workshop with Margaret. The space was quiet, tools arranged neatly, half-finished projects waiting for tomorrow. Do you ever regret it? Margaret asked. Any of it? Clara thought about Iron Ridge, about the girl she'd been, hopeful and naive, about everything she'd lost and everything she'd gained. I regret that it was necessary, she said finally. I regret that women have to fight so hard for basic autonomy, but the actual leaving, the building something new? She shook her head. No, not for a second. Good. Margaret raised her teacup in a small salute. To necessary revolutions. To surviving them. They drank in comfortable silence, 2 women who'd taken broken things, marriages, expectations, whole lives, and made them into something worth keeping. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, soft and transformative. Clara watched it accumulate on the workshop windows, each flake unique and temporary, and part of something larger. She thought about Thomas sleeping upstairs, dreaming whatever 4-year-olds dream. Thought about the students arriving next week, ready to learn. Thought about the manuscript waiting on her desk, challenging and possible. Her hand went to her chest, feeling her own heartbeat. Steady, strong, entirely her own. She'd left Iron Ridge on a night like this, snow falling and future uncertain. Had walked away from security into chaos, carrying nothing but hope and stubbornness and a child who hadn't yet been born. And now here she was. Not in a grand manner or a perfect life, but in a workshop that smelled of leather and possibility, surrounded by people she'd chosen and work that mattered. Not invisible, not silent, not disappeared. Just Clara. Mother, binder, teacher, survivor. Free. The snow fell harder, blanketing the world in white. Inside, the fire burned warm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new restorations, new women seeking the same freedom Clara had fought for. But tonight was for rest, for gratitude, for the quiet knowledge that she'd taken the hardest path and found, at its end, exactly what she'd been looking for. Herself, whole and imperfect, and finally, completely enough.